passage, we find these words. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So you'll notice that in Revelation 13 verse 10, the expression patience of the saints appears immediately before the end time crisis is described. Those who go through this period must have the patience of the saints. Revelation 14:12, immediately after speaking about the beast and his image and his mark, it says that there's a group that needs to have the patience of the saints. So obviously the patience of the saints refers to an end time group who has this specific quality. Now we need to define some terms. First of all, we need to define the word patience. And then of course we're going to see who the saints are. The word patience in the New Testament is the Greek word hupomone. There are two words in the New Testament, two primary words that express patience. One is translated in the King James, long suffering. That's the word makrothumia. That means to suffer long. That's not the word that is used here in these two passages. The word that is used is hupomone. And let me tell you what that word means. It means to hang in there, no matter what the cost, to persevere, to endure, to be steadfast, to be independent, unyielding, and defiant in the face of aggressive misfortune. In other words, this word is not simply sitting down and saying, okay, I'll be patient. No, this is an active patience. This is an endurance or a perseverance. By the way, it's the same word that is used in Matthew 24, where Jesus says, he who endures until the end will be saved. So this is an active patience. It's a patience of people who are unyielding, unbreaking in their faith and in their trust in God. Now the question is, who are the saints? Because this is the patience of the saints. Who are the saints? Well, you know, depending on which group of Christians you're talking to, they would understand the word saints in a different way. You know, for some people, the saints are, like all of the saints that are mentioned in California. Seems like there's a saint for every city in California. So they think that these saints are these heroes, these wonderful Christians throughout the period of Christian history. But in the Bible, the saints represent primarily, specifically in Daniel and Revelation, those who are persecuted by the little horn, by the beast, and by the harlot of Revelation 17. In other words, the saints are not just any group. They are the ones who were persecuted by these end-time powers. I want to read several statements from Scripture so that you can see this. Notice Daniel chapter 7, verses 21 and 22. We're defining the saints. The saints are those who suffered persecution under the beast, the little horn, and who will suffer persecution under the harlot, this apostate church. It says there in Daniel 7, verse 21, I was watching, and the same horn was making war against whom? Against the saints, and prevailing against them. So the saints are God's persecuted people. Notice Revelation 13 and verse 7. Here it speaks about the beast, which is the same as the little horn. This is the way it reads. It was granted to him, that is to the beast, to make war with whom? With the saints, and to overcome them. So once again, the saints are those who are persecuted. Those who are persecuted by the little horn or by the beast. Notice Revelation chapter 17 and verse 6. Revelation 17 and verse 6. It says, I saw the woman. This is a harlot woman, so it's a fallen church. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of whom? Of the saints. There it is again. And with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. So my question is this. When it speaks in Revelation about the patience of the saints, is this referring to a group of people who need to exercise patience because they are being persecuted? Yes. Within the context of prophecy, this is a persecuted group. Now, we know that in Scripture, the saints and the woman represent the same thing. Let me just mention how we determine that. We just read in Daniel 7 that the little horn persecutes the saints. We read that the beast of Revelation 13 also persecutes the saints. And how long does the little horn, how long does the beast, how long do they persecute the saints? Well, times, and the dividing of time. And in Revelation chapter 13, it's for a period of 1,260 days or a period of 42 months. Now, the little horn, in other words, and the beast persecute the saints for 1,260 years. But it's interesting to notice that in Revelation chapter 12, it says that the dragon persecutes the woman for 1,260 days. So let me ask you, are the saints and the woman the same thing? Absolutely. Because the little horn and the beast persecute the saints, whereas we're told also in Revelation 12 that the dragon persecutes the woman. So the saints are the woman. And the woman represents what? The woman represents specifically the church. So are you understanding what we're talking about when we deal with the word patience? It's dealing with God's people who are being persecuted by the beast and by the harlot and by the little horn, and they have to exercise incredible perseverance, incredible, unshakable, and unbreakable faith in order to stand firm and not worship the beast or receive his mark or the number of his name. Now, I believe that Jesus told a parable that illustrates what is meant by the expression, the patience of the saints. This parable is found in the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 18 and verses 1 through 8. And I'm going to just read this parable, and I want you to listen carefully because we're going to then study each verse individually. Luke chapter 18 verses 1 through 8. Here Jesus is describing this period when God's people, the saints, are going to have to exercise this patience of the saints, this unshakable, unbreakable, unyielding faith and trust in the face of horrendous persecution. It says there, "Then he spoke a parable to them, that men always ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, there was in a certain city, a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him saying, get justice for me from my adversary. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Then the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect, who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? So this is the parable that I believe is describing the phrase, the patience of the saints. Now we're going to take a look at this parable, and we're going to study it verse by verse to see how it applies, especially to the end time. Let's begin at verse 1. Then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray. Two lessons from this parable. Men always ought to pray and not what? And not lose heart. In other words, they should always pray and they should never give up in their prayer experience in coming to God. And then I want you to notice verse 2. Here's the parable. Saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now the question is, what does the judge in this parable represent? Well, the fact is, folks, that the judge represents God. And you say, now wait a minute, Pastor Bohr. It says that this judge did not fear God or regard man. How can he represent God? The way in which this judge represents God is a comparison by way of contrast. In other words, they're not being compared as being equal. They're being compared by contrast. And we'll see this as we study along. We're going to notice in the parable that this widow comes to the judge, and she keeps on coming and coming, and the judge, he delays giving her justice, and finally says, to get her off my back, I'm going to give her what she's asking for. And then, of course, we're going to notice in the parable that the lesson is, if this judge actually answers the pleas of the widow in order to get her off his back, how much more will God answer our pleas, not to get us off his back, but because he loves us? In other words, it's a comparison by way of contrast. They're not equal. They're not the same. God is in some senses the same as the judge, but in the sense of the reason why he answers, God is different. And so there's a comparison by way of contrast. Now, notice Luke chapter 18 and verse 3. So the judge represents God. Now let's notice the widow. It says, now there was a widow in that city. Now the question is, what does the widow represent? The judge is God. What does the widow represent? Well, what does a woman symbolize in Bible prophecy? A woman represents the church. That's right. But is this a woman under ordinary circumstances? No. She's not a common, ordinary, married woman. This woman is a what? She's a widow woman. In other words, she is totally destitute of any earthly support. She has lost everything she has, we're going to notice as we study along. In other words, this is a woman, this is the church under extraordinary circumstances. Now, in the book of Revelation, the woman is used as a symbol of the church. And the woman is persecuted by the dragon. In other words, the woman is left destitute. She has to flee. She can't take anything with her. This is the period that is being described in this parable. It is a woman, it represents the church, but it's not the common ordinary church. It's the church that has lost everything that it has, all earthly support. In other words, this woman has been cleaned out by her adversary, and her only hope is found in the intervention of the judge in her behalf. Now, according to the parable, who does the widow represent? Well, if you read the parable, it says, will God not avenge his elect? As this judge avenged the widow, so God will avenge his elect. So what does the widow represent? She represents the elect of God. Another way of looking at it is she represents the saints of God. Now, according to most scholars who have studied this parable, they've concluded that probably this woman's husband had a debt with a creditor, and he died, and he didn't pay his debt. And so the creditor was actually taking everything away from this widow to pay for her husband's debt. In other words, this woman was totally dispossessed. She had no children. She had no home. She had no money. She had no friends. She was all alone, and she was forsaken of everyone. She had no human support because her adversary had cleaned her out totally and completely. Now let's go to chapter 18 and verse 3, the last half of the verse. It says there, and she came to him saying, get justice for me from my adversary. Now, that verb came is not real well translated there. It's actually a continuous tense. It's a continual tense. It means that she kept coming. She continually came. In other words, she didn't just come once and leave it at that. She kept on coming and coming and coming. You say, how do we know that? Well, first of all, the tense of the Greek verb is a continual tense. But also, if you notice verse 5, it says a little bit later in verse 5 that the judge says, I will avenge her, yes, lest by her continual coming she weary me. So you notice that this woman didn't only come once or twice and say, what's the use? I give up. This judge is never going to do justice. No, she kept on coming and coming and coming, even though she was a woman that was totally destitute. I want you to notice something very interesting about this woman. This woman, which represents the church, totally destitute of human support, had a faith which was independent, unyielding, and defiant in the face of aggressive misfortune. But in the story, we also have an adversary. The Greek word is antidikon. The question is, who is this adversary? What is represented by the adversary in the parable that totally cleaned her out, that took everything and left her without any human support? Who is this adversary? Well, 1 Peter 5 verse 8 uses the same word to describe Satan. Notice what it says in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. Be sober. Be vigilant. Because your adversary, the antidikon, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may what? Seeking whom he may devour. So who is the adversary that took everything from the widow? The adversary represents the devil. The adversary represents Satan. Now the question is, did this judge answer the widow's pleas immediately? No. Did she give up? No. What kind of patience did she have? She just sit down, she says, I'll wait for the judge to do it. No. She had a persevering faith, a persevering patience, an active patience, if you please. She says, I'm going to continue coming to him until I get justice, and I'm not going to give up. But there's a delay in the parable. Notice Luke chapter 18, verses 4 and 5. The judge does not answer her pleas immediately. It says, and he would not for a while. Is there a delay in the woman's pleas? Absolutely. But afterward, he said within himself, though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she what? She weary me. Did he give her justice for the right reason? No. He actually decided that he would avenge her to get her off his back. Is that the way that God listens to our pleas? He says, I'm just sick and tired of them coming and presenting their pleas before me, so I'm just going to give them what they ask so that I can get some sleep. That's not the way God is. You see, God is being compared with a judge by way of contrast. There is a delay in both cases. But when finally the judge answers, he answers for the wrong reason. When God answers, he answers for the right reason. Now let's go to Luke chapter 18 and verse 7. Here comes now the main lesson that Jesus wants to teach in this parable. It says there in chapter 18 verse 7, and shall God not avenge his own elect? So who does the widow represent? The elect. Who does the judge represent? God. And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out, what? Day and night to him. Do they continue coming? Is this a patient endurance? Is this a perseverance that doesn't give up? Even in the worst case scenario? Absolutely. But does God answer their pleas immediately? No, because it says, and shall not God avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he what? Though he bears long with them. Now, there are different versions of the Bible, of course, and it's interesting to notice how some of these versions translate this expression, though he bears long with them. The New International Version has this translation, will he keep putting them off? Does that mean that he did put them off for a while? Absolutely. Will he keep putting them off? The Jerusalem Bible has it this way, even when he delays to help them, so there is a delay. Or the Weymouth translation says, although he delays vengeance on their behalf. So is it clear that God is going to delay answering the pleas of his people in this period of human history? Absolutely. Now I want you to notice Luke 18 and verses 6 through 8. We already read verses 6 and 7, but I want us to notice the flow now. Luke 18 verses 6 through 8. Then the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God, who is the judge by the way, not avenge over whom? The adversary, right? Shall God not avenge his own elect, that's the widow, who cry out day and night to him, though He bears long, there you have the delay, though He bears long with them. And then comes the answer. I tell you that He will what? Avenge them speedily. So even though there's a delay, is God going to intervene and avenge His elect over the adversary? And He's going to do it speedily. The Bible says yes. And then notice how the passage ends. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith in the earth? What is Jesus saying? He's saying, nevertheless, when I come, am I going to find this kind of faith that this widow had on the earth? And the parable ends. Now the question is, when does this parable especially apply in human history? Well, we need to look at the context. And I'm just going to not read the verses because there's too many of them. But if you look at the verses that come immediately before the parable, which would be Luke chapter 17 and verses 26 to 37, all of those verses are talking about the second coming of Jesus. And if you read the last verse that we just read from the parable, it says, nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith in the earth? The parable concludes by reference to the second coming. So the question is, when does this parable especially apply to? There's no doubt that it applies especially to the time of the second coming of Christ, because the passage that comes before the parable is talking of the second coming. The parable ends by asking the question, when the Son of Man comes, will He find faith on the earth? And so we know that this parable, in between the two passages that talk about the second coming, is referring to the crisis that will take place at the end of time. Now let's review the symbols. The judge represents God. The adversary represents Satan. The widow symbolizes the church. What kind of church? Just the church in times of peace like today, where everybody has plenty? Absolutely not. It's the church in dire straits. The church of the end time, the church of the tribulation, we're going to notice. And yet we notice that there's a delay. But after the delay, what does God do? God answers the pleas of His people. Now the question is, what is this parable really referring to in terms of time? Folks, I have no doubts whatsoever that Jesus is here speaking about the terrible time of tribulation that is going to fall upon this earth. It's going to be a time of trouble such as never has been seen in the history of the world. And only those who have the patience of the saints will stand before the beast and his image and will refuse the mark even on pain of death. They will not be immediately delivered. There will be a delay. They will have to go through this time of trouble, lose everything that they have, and yet they will not cease to come to God in prayer and to plead for His blessing and to plead for His protection and to plead for His presence with them. By the way, most Christians are expecting a pre-tribulation rapture. Are you going to need a special kind of patience and faith to get through this period? We noticed immediately before Revelation, or after Revelation 13 verse 10, you have the beast, his image, and his mark. Immediately after the third angel's message, you have what? A reference to those who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus, and those who have the patience of the saints. And so it's speaking about the severe crisis that is going to come upon the world. And the patience of the saints will be needed by God's people. But if you believe that you're going to go to heaven before the tribulation, why would you prepare for it? See, the devil is shrewd. He knows that the church is going to be here during the tribulation. He knows that we're going to need unshakable and unbreakable faith. He knows that we're going to need the patience of the saints to get through this period, to reject the beast and his image and the mark. And so he teaches Christians, says, don't worry about that. That's for the Jews after the church is in heaven. And when they find themselves in the time of trouble, they will be totally unprepared for the crisis that is taking place upon the world. By the way, that word elect that is used in the parable, I want you to notice Matthew 24 and verses 22 and 24, how that word elect is used in the context of the time of trouble and the final tribulation. Matthew 24, verse 22. It says, and except those days, this is the tribulation according to the context, should be what? Shortened. There should be no flesh be saved. But for whose sake? There's the key word in the parable. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be what? Shortened. Are God's people going to go through the tribulation? Yes. Is there going to be a delay? There most certainly will be a delay. But is God going to intervene to answer their pleas? Absolutely. Now notice verse 24. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive whom? The very elect. There's the word again. So when does this parable especially apply to? It applies to the period of tribulation through which the elect will go, according to Jesus in Matthew chapter 24. You see, folks, the widow represents the final generation of living saints that will dwell upon this earth. The book of Revelation calls them the 144,000. We have a complete lecture coming up on the 144,000. These people follow the Lamb wherever He goes. These people reject the beast. They reject His image. They reject the mark. They reject the number of His name. They plead day and night for deliverance from their enemies, from the adversary. They don't give up. They have unflinching perseverance to face this end-time crisis. Well, let me ask you, who is the adversary during this period? The adversary, folks, is what? Is the devil. Is the devil going to take away from the church everything that the church has in terms of earthly support? Absolutely. The church, those who are faithful in the church, will be left totally destitute. And who will strip them of everything that they have? The devil will strip them of everything that they have. And they will have absolutely no earthly support. And as the parable says, they will cry out day and night for deliverance over their adversary who has taken everything that they have.